Hello and welcome to episode 94 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Omeleth.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. So today we're going to talk about how you lot got into development in the first place. Andy, what got you into it?
My parents didn't really think that either we couldn't afford a computer or they didn't think it was worth having. But one day a computer arrived on our doorstep from my granddad. And it was a Sinclair ZX Spectrum.
Showing your age there.
Yeah, I am showing my age. And my dad read the manual in order to learn how to program it in BASIC. And then my dad taught me how to program it based on what he'd learned from the manual. And I was immediately hooked. I found it utterly exciting, much more exciting than anything that was going on outside of the house.
What was the first thing you did? 10 print something, 20 go to 10 run?
Yeah. 10 print Andy is cool, 20 go to 10, absolutely.
Yeah. That's like literally as far as I got with development, unfortunately.
Yeah, my dad did cool things like he did like a simulation of how a ball moves when you throw it, and gravity makes it curve down. And then he wrote a little game where you had to like catch the ball. And so I gradually learned stuff from him.
Amleth, there was this thing called BASIC in the 80s. Like you probably might have heard about that in a textbook in a museum, maybe.
I've heard about it, yes. My dad tried to get me into programming when I was younger, probably early teens, and it never really stuck. He got me a Raspberry Pi as a birthday gift. All I ever used it for was a little computer. I never messed with any of the programming anything. I think the first programming I did was the startup script for i3. So I was automating launching applications and stuff. But then even after doing a little bit of scripting here and there to automate some stuff, I never actually got into programming until years later. And that was Go, because I decided I like the tool chain for this language. It spits out statically linked binaries for a whole bunch of different platforms. Cross compilation is super easy. Let's get into this.
So you completely skipped Python then?
Yeah. I didn't learn Python until I had my first development job. I started with Go. I think it's a very good one to start with because it's so simple and easy to pick up.
Also showing your age, Amelith, just in the opposite direction.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. I think I might have been somewhere between 17 and 19 maybe when I started trying to pick up Go.
And then COVID happened, and now here we are.
I don't actually remember why I got into programming. Now, I know my mom was a software developer and her dad was a software developer. So apparently it's in my bloodline somehow. But I don't remember exactly why I started. I do remember trying to learn some Python and using their REPL. And then the very first thing I remember like actually finding useful and trying to do myself was with a Visual Studio trial license or something, using, I want to say it was .NET, and it was to build a indexer for all of my CDs because I had a lot of like comics and software and things on all of these various CDs, and I hated going through 100 different CDs to figure out what was on which CD. So I built this GUI indexer where I could index all of my CDs and then search through it on this GUI and be like, oh, that's CD 3B, and then go grab that CD and pop it in and get whatever it was I needed out of it. And that kind of hooked me. I don't know exactly why that particular thing stuck, but from then on, I was like, I can make the computer do what I want. This is great.
That is the joy.
I'm surprised that none of you have said anything about web development, because the whole idea of being able to view source and everything seems to be what got a fair number of people into development.
I was thinking about web development while I was listening to people speak, because even though I started on Sinclair BASIC, the thing that really excited me was a program called Amos BASIC on the Amiga. And that was still BASIC, although very, very different from Sinclair BASIC. But it was a very graphical environment. You could make a game quite easily. It had specialized stuff for drawing sprites on the screen. You could easily open a window and draw graphics and things. And I just found that so exciting, just writing games. And it was very, very immediate. And it strikes me that, in theory at least, we have a very immediate graphical environment that is open to everyone to program in the web environment. You only need a text editor and a web browser, and you can start coding quite a graphical thing, like a game, right there.
I think for me, at least when it came to web development, like I definitely tried it and did the little hello world or, whatever in HTML. But I pretty quickly bounced off of it, probably just because I don't have an artistic bone in my body. I can barely draw stick figures. So that visual aspect didn't really hook me. And then I didn't have the fundamentals to appreciate like what JavaScript was doing in the front end versus the back end. I think I just found that confusing. So I just bounced off of it somewhat naturally.
So for you, it's more about the thing it's doing rather than what it actually looks like.
Oh, I would say the visual aspect has almost nothing to do with what I think of, or when I'm even currently, I'm not very visual at all when it comes to the programs that I write. So, actually, now that you say it, I do think of way back. I think I was in high school programming a like TI-86 or TI-89. I don't remember what it was, some sort of calculator, and just like punching in all of the codes to make some little video or asteroids like game appear on this calculator. That's probably the very first programming I ever did, but I didn't really know it was programming. I just knew it was printing off 100 pages of random codes, plugging them in, and not being bored during math class.
Because I've heard quite a lot of people say it was customizing my MySpace page that got me into coding. Right. People of roughly my age. Were you lot just too cool for that then?
I've done my fair share of web programming. Like I said, I think it's a real opportunity there because it's like a simple environment but highly visual. But I don't feel like we're tapping that opportunity for young people to learn that way.
Now that you mention web stuff, I do remember one of the very first things I did with that Raspberry Pi was figure out how to use it as a server. Put a website on it, start running things like Nextcloud. That's how I got started with systems administration. And as part of having my own personal website, I did have to learn a little bit of HTML and CSS and such. But there was no JavaScript, so I wouldn't call it programming, just writing markup.
You might have just angered some CSS people.
Yeah. You got to be careful.
At the time, I wasn't doing any of the actual programming that CSS has now. So that wasn't programming, but modern CSS is much more powerful.
I think that might be part of why web development hasn't delivered on that promise that I'm suggesting it has, because it's not very simple at all. Like, it has these 3 languages you have to learn to do anything. Plus, if you actually get into like modern web development, it's a massive amount of complexity of builds and packages, and suddenly the simplicity is just gone.
You forgot about the 4th language, PHP.
I've done my fair share of PHP.
I think it has a very simple and easy on-ramp, but then once you start adding stuff, complexity adds up very, very quickly.
But I don't even think we give people that on-ramp. Like, if you Google for how to make a website, you probably find a page about installing NPM and making your life miserable from then on.
What about no code or low code? Did either of you start with any of those types of tools, or have you even used them along your journey?
My first paid job was writing Visual Basic for applications in Microsoft Excel. Does that count? And I then did some more Visual Basic in Microsoft Access. That was like a 4G, I think they called it. So not low code or no code, but less code.
I could see that counting, at least for the low code part of it.
It was obviously terrible, just to make that clear.
I think all of the ones that I've at least touched have been, I would go out on a limb and say, moderately terrible as well. Although I would also say that I touched those a little bit later in my career. So I was more frustrated by what they couldn't do than by what they were actually proposing.
I can't criticize Visual Basic for applications in Microsoft Excel too much, because I learned SQL, the database language, by graphically dragging and dropping boxes and lines and then looking at the code that it produced.
Well, if we go all the way back to this indexing program that I was talking about earlier, that's exactly what that was. And that's how I got into it, was by dragging and dropping some checkboxes and things and seeing the code that generated writing a few, I forget what they even call them, like event handlers back in the day. And out came something I could run and use.
Yeah, and there's an immediacy to that, which is helpful when you're just learning what programming even is, right? Like the connection between dragging things and then seeing code produced.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. When you go through airport security, there's one line where the TSA agent checks your ID and another where a machine scans your bag. The same thing happens in enterprise security, but instead of passengers and luggage, it's end users and their devices. These days, most companies are pretty good at the first part of the equation, where they check user identity. But user devices can roll right through authentication without getting inspected at all. In fact, a huge percentage of companies allow unmanaged, untrusted devices to access their data. That means an employee can log in from a laptop that has its firewall turned off and hasn't been updated in 6 months. Or worse, that laptop might belong to a bad actor using employee credentials. Kolide finally solves the device trust problem. Kolide ensures that no device can log into your Okta-protected apps unless it passes your security checks. Plus, you can use Kolide on devices without MDM, like your Linux fleet, contractor devices, and every BYOD phone and laptop in your company. So support the show and go to kolide.com/LinuxDevTime to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/LinuxDevTime. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxdevtime.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you also get quite a lot of episodes a day or so early. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxdevtime.com. What about learning new technologies now, though? How do you do it? Do you do it with books or videos or courses or what?
At the moment, I'm banging my head against it until I get it to work. I know that's probably not a great approach. So, Andy, Kevin, do you have any input?
I think the industry term for banging your head against it is a code kata. You just keep trying a little problem over and over, possibly in different ways, until it starts to stick, or small little problems, which is actually a good way to do it.
Okay.
You must be referencing something, though, Ameth, like man pages or something.
Search engine. How do I need to do thing in Kotlin? How do thing in Kotlin?
Right. And then ChatGPT says, do it like this, and then it doesn't work.
Yeah, that has happened more than once today.
Need to Google, why does Kotlin do async differently from everyone else?
Yeah, if I looked at things that I'm learning nowadays, I would say if it's in the realm of something I already have experience in, most likely I'm just going to try and re-implement something that I'm already intimately familiar with the details. That way I can focus on the nuances of the new thing rather than learning the new thing along with some other new paradigm that I'm not used to, or some new problem set. That's probably the biggest way. I also do a lot of videos, or I'll at least look at a video and put it on a higher speed. Just kind of skim through what are some of the gotchas, or what's kind of the thought of the best practices out there.
Another thing I'm doing at the moment to learn Kotlin, I don't know why it didn't come to my mind at first, is going through the Android training courses on developer.android.com. And they have a lot of good information about best practices and design patterns and for doing things and such.
That's actually a really good example of how I don't learn new technologies, because I've multiple times tried to work through some of those Android tutorials, and I just ended up thinking, I can't be bothered to do Android, it's too difficult.
Yeah, it is a bit of a pain.
All the design patterns and, yeah.
It's just completely foreign, I think.
Right. I actually do like a combination often. I definitely bang my head against things, and that's the only way that knowledge really goes in, I think, if you get stuck and then you work your way through. But at the same time, I'll be trying to read things. And I learned quite late in my life that I thought I was like an analytical mind type, because I must be, because I like programming. And I realized that I'm maybe intuitive or something like that. So I actually find what works really well for me is to read a whole book or watch a whole series of videos, get the complete overview of the whole thing, not remember any of it, but just have a kind of feeling for what it's like. And then when I start banging my head against it, I've got more context. That works really well for me.
Maybe I should try that.
I like that idea. I'm going to have to try that on the next one, of loading up a lot of context that you know you're not going to store long term, or maybe it'll be harder to retrieve, but just having that there, this being the second time you're seeing something as you go through it a little bit deeper the second time. That's an excellent idea. I'm going to have to try that as well.
It helps that I just really enjoy it. I remember I was working somewhere and I had a commute on the train, and I printed out, this is dating me again, but I printed out the entire documentation for the Python standard library, and then I just read through it on the train. And I really enjoyed it, which says something about me, I think.
A friend of mine piped the Perl man pages into, what is it, LP, I think, to print the man pages, and he kept them in a binder in his backpack as he was learning Perl.
Nice.
Another thing I've started doing more recently, like last few years, is using a note-taking system. For me, Obsidian, but I've used a bunch of different ones as well, and just dropping in literally anything I can about said subject, whether it be a blog post or a link or just my own little notes as I'm going through learning something. And then having that whole kind of collective, being able to query it and re-reference it as I'm going through, that has also really helped, because it helps you get some of those things out of your short-term memory, where they don't take up that space and you can load up more context and do some more deeper things, but it's still really quick to recall all of that stuff without taking up that limited short-term memory.
I should do that. I never do any note-taking and I never remember anything, and I don't think it's a coincidence.
I'm trying to start as of like 2 or 3 days ago. I picked up Logseek. I tried it a few years ago, didn't stick with it, but I realized I was using it wrong. Maybe if I use it how the developers intend, it'll work better for me.
So I'm sure everybody's a little bit different, but for me, what really helped, because I was struggling with note-taking as well. I wanted to note-take, and I knew I wanted to have this collection of notes, but I could never fully make it stick.
Yep.
All the different applications and different times that I tried it. What really made it stick was stop caring about structure, which is the opposite of what I want to do in every other part of my life and career, is not have things labeled well, not have them structured in files and folders correctly, literally just dump it into Obsidian somehow on a new note every single time. And it turned out that Obsidian specifically, the search features are good enough that really helped. And that's what has fixed my note-taking and allowed me to kind of flourish in using it this time.
So I guess we should probably be a bit clearer what we mean when we say banging our heads against things. I'm guessing, Amalith, it means you're trying to solve a real-world problem with this technology?
Yes, not a contrived problem.
Right. So Kevin's already mentioned katas as a way of giving yourself like a contrived problem, but something that helps you exercise your way.
I think for me, the hardest part is just having a problem. It doesn't necessarily have to be contrived or not, but it has to be a problem to solve. When they're like, they being a tutorial or whatever, just says like, oh, think of something you want to work on or think of something you want done. That to me doesn't help because there's all kinds of things I want done, but they're massive projects and they're not something I'm going to pick up when I'm just learning a brand new language or whatever it is.
Is this a case of they've already paid you, Amalith, and you've got to get it done?
No, they're actively paying me and I have to get it done.
Close then.
I have my own personal kata, which is that I write a snake game in whatever new technology I'm using. And it's quite nice because it forces you to do the annoying bits like the UI and user input and stuff like that. And I just love snake games.
Have you done one in Bash?
I haven't done one in Bash, but I've done one in Terraform, which was, I can tell you, quite a significant challenge.
How did you make a snake game in Terraform?
Yeah, that seems not possible.
Stupid? Yeah. Well, I cheated. Like, it had to call the program multiple times. Like, you had to run the Terraform build multiple times, and each time it gave you the next time step of your game.
I see.
You remember how we talked about CI/CD systems using a lot of energy and extra compute?
Yeah, I mean, I can't justify this.
Yeah, it's not going to be on Steam anytime soon.
That's almost as bad as orchestrating Docker containers from within Minecraft.
I did, when I was learning about Docker, I did write a CGI program in Sinclair Basic wrapped up in a Docker image. So you could serve a web page that was being created by a Sinclair Basic program.
Andy, you mentioned that making this snake game, you like it because it exercises a bunch of different components like the UI and all these other things. Do both of you pick projects like that because they're going to exercise something you need to use in that language or paradigm or framework or whatever? Or is it just something that you're familiar with?
I generally use Snake just because, I don't know, I just love writing Snake in things. So it's not very deliberate. But normally, if I'm learning something for work, I'll just try and get on with the thing I'm doing. You know, I won't do some kind of toy problem. But I do find it goes a lot better for me if I've already read up and got that context, as I was talking about before.
I don't think I've ever had one of those programs that I re-implement in another language to learn the language. I think I've always tried to solve some sort of problem. And that's actually why I didn't get started programming for a while, even though I knew it was there and I knew I eventually wanted to. I just couldn't think of something to solve.
Right.
Yeah, that goes back to that problem of just do something that you want to see done. That's a hard thing for me. I prefer if it's, oh, I have this problem I need to solve. Cool. I will use this tool to solve that problem, and I can figure that part of it out.
And I think, like a lot of programmers, I really enjoy having something that's really, really well defined as a problem, right? So whether it's a spec that I can follow or something like that. So there is something really attractive about just re-implementing something you've already done, just because it's like safe and comfortable.
Do you do that only to learn new languages, or do you also use that technique to learn things like GUI frameworks?
Oh yeah, I've definitely used Snake to learn, like I used Snake to learn like Qt, I think it was 4 at the time. Or
I've also used that technique when I want to flex a particular thing of a language or framework that I'm already familiar with but just a new way to go about it, whether I'm trying to do it in a functional manner this time, or I'm trying to go deeper into generics or whatever it is. I've definitely used some of these things I'm already familiar with.
But I also use Snake just to make me happy. So I'm writing a game framework in Rust for the web, and I was getting really bogged down in the menu system, and it's really boring. So yesterday I just thought, forget this. I'm just going to write Snake in this framework and then get back to the menus later. Now I feel happy again.
I find most often what keeps me from getting bored or having to slog through it is if it's something I know has a use later on. For example, if it's a problem at work or a problem adjacent to something at work, if I know like, hey, once I solve this, I'll be able to use it, that usually gives me enough motivation to be like, oh no, I actually want to see this thing in action.
Well, we'd better wrap it up then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.